the hollowing hegemony.
There are 200 different minerals that contained rare earths, and some of them have military applications, some of them have transportation and renewable energy applications. And for example, the lighter rare earths like cerium in connection with phosphorus can be used in water purifiers. Lanthanum is used as a hydrogen absorber in rechargeable batteries. Praseodymium is used in alloys with magnesium to build aircraft engines. For heavier rare earths, dysprosium oxide is used to cool fuel rods and nuclear reactors. Terbium is used in solid-state drives for data storage, a critical technology across various industries, and they all are used in defense applications. So let me tell you, without it, modern technology, our green transition, and defense applications will not happen. And this is why it's so important that the West collectively, US, Europe, Japan, Australia, all have their own supply chain and are not dependent on our Chinese friends.
Ariel Cohen is the Managing Director of the Energy, Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Centre, who, in addition to that, is also a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Prior to that position, though, Ariel spent 20 years at the Heritage Foundation as the Senior Research Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Studies and International Energy Policy Programs, directed Heritage's war games, and worked closely with members of Congress and congressional staff members to help craft national security and energy policy. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
So you see that China is still occupying a disproportionately large and strategic position across the board, upstream, midstream, downstream. China will not hesitate to impose sanctions or to cut supply, as they did in 2009 and then again in 2023.
So having looked at a lot of your previous work, you've referred to this issue as a national security issue. And for me, I very much agree with you on that one. I think it's going to be pretty hard to ask China for europium or yttrium for our F-35s if they're also trying to shoot those down at the same time. So if this is a national security issue, how do we beat China in this theater?
It's a very important question. It's important on the level of how America conducts business in the fierce competition with China, but it's even more important in terms of national security. We need steady production, and we need to take back this whole supply chain. We need to build it. It doesn't exist yet, but we need to build it. And I'm afraid, honestly, that we don't have the time. The clouds are gathering both in Europe with Russia as well as in the Pacific, in South China Sea and Taiwan. And we don't have the time to build the supply chain. So by hook or by crook, we need to build it, be it here in the United States, maybe in Canada and Mexico, and some amount with our allies in Europe and Australia.
One of the suggestions that's been floated quite a lot is one where the US returns to its Cold War playbook and starts buying up large stockpiles of these rare earths to put aside for a rainy day. What are your thoughts on pursuing something like that as a strategy?
We absolutely should stockpile, but the Chinese are not stupid. If they see us starting to stockpile, they'll start squelching. They already did it. They did it with Japan as a punishment for Ryukyu Islands conflict. So if we stockpile, the Chinese will drive the prices up, make it more expensive, or kill the supply altogether because they understand the strategic implications of such a supply. But we have no choice. We need to build the stockpile.
And I'd be shocked if the US aren't doing that already through third-party countries or harnessing some of the black market minerals that exist. But the big conventional talk of the town, the big strategy the US seem to be pursuing, is the one Biden proposed just a few years ago, with the centerpiece of this strategy being Washington's massive investment into building rare earths here in the United States, as well as looking to boost support for rare earth production in allied countries like Australia and South Korea. But with the private sector still being consistently undercut by China, and the public sector probably not possessing enough demand to facilitate the desired level of production within the United States organically, how do we foster a long-term, robust domestic rare earth industry?
When we manufacture in the US, it has its good side, its bad side. The Biden administration and the Trump administration before it pretty much remained on the same track of reshoring, friendshoring, bringing back the more sensitive technologies from China, and sometimes not just sensitive technologies. Look, if I bought an EV that is made in China and pay $10,000 less, as a consumer, I win. But as an American, knowing that these jobs left Detroit or Alabama and went to China, I understand what's going on.
Now, as a part of these programs put in place by the Biden administration, most purchases by US companies working with the government, but especially the Department of Defense, will be forced to buy all of their rare earths from the United States or one of its selected allies once these refineries are up and running, which on the surface makes sense because it drives domestic demand and makes sure that the supply chain stays on home soil. However, there are underlying concerns with this strategy as well, as if you go one way with it and you make it absolutely airtight and really bring the hammer down on any company breaking those rules, then you can very quickly reach a point where if the demand for military equipment surges, but the rare earth refineries can't surge to meet that additional demand by the same rate, if not more, what you've then done is introduce an artificial bottleneck into the domestic production chain, where rather than being able to just buy up other countries' stockpiles at a higher price to facilitate any possible required surge in production you might have, under that system, you don't have that as an option. So potentially you could end up in a situation where you have the entire US war effort waiting on just a single refinery, which again, not great. But if you go the other way with the rules and make the restrictions around this one quite weak, in other words, pretty much what the restrictions are at the moment, it does open up loopholes that can be easily exploited. So for example, if someone from, let's say, Lockheed Martin is building an F-35, they would 100% be banned from buying rare earths from China, stipulating that they have to buy all of their rare earths from Americans. Again, which sounds reasonable. But with these rules the way they are, someone like Lockheed could also buy those rare earths from any Americans, making it very easy to, let's say, use one of their subcontractors, hire them to buy up a whole bunch of rare earths in China, and then buy the rare earths off that subcontractor, therefore technically meeting the definition of buying rare earths from an American, particularly if they pretend not to know where those rare earths came from in the first place. Now, just because they could buy it through a subcontractor doesn't necessarily mean they will, but they are also a private company. And if they were looking to save some money, well, under the current rules, that option's always there. So you think that under a system like the one that's coming into place, there is still a risk of companies, whether they're in the US or not, using loopholes like that to circumvent some of these restrictions that try to curb the Chinese rare earth industry?
Oh, absolutely. For example, with the Russia sanctions now, countries make money by buying American microchips and then reselling them to Russia. So what you just described can happen.
And seeing as people are getting away with selling American microchips to Russian companies, microchips being a somewhat identifiable product, it becomes even easier to smuggle rare commodities. As while one microchip is almost always different to another, a kilo of neodymium produced in the United States, by definition, is almost exactly the same as a kilo of pure neodymium produced within China, especially if they're ever melted down and re-stamped with US markings, making the smuggling of rare earths even easier to do than microchips, which, if that is the case, how do you combat an issue like this?
You regulate. That's why we have a bloated bureaucracy in the US government, including in the Pentagon. We can procure from the global market in the security space, and other things we have to build the domestic or friend-shoring supply chain, be it Canada, Mexico, Australia, or somewhere in Europe.
Now, one of the options also consistently put forward to be able to build that domestic manufacturing base, whilst still utilizing the free market, is through the US subsidizing domestic rare earth production and refining to a point where it's economically competitive with the Chinese, and thereby driving demand back toward the US. As whilst most of the private sector will go to China when it's cheaper, if the US market goes cheaper, or even just a slight bit over China, there's a good chance that a lot of them will pull their manufacturing back toward the United States. Although I'm also pretty sure you won't get everyone, as right now China does offer the convenience of top-to-tail manufacturing supply chains in this area. Regardless of that, what are your thoughts on using subsidies in order to make the United States rare earth capacity competitive on the world stage?
You don't need subsidies as long as you have a steady policy of ordering these supplies and paying for them. If you know that you have a 10-year contract with Department of Defense or Department of Energy or with a large manufacturer like Tesla, you do not need subsidy and you do not need nationalization. You don't need the government to run it. The only sector that I can think of where the government is 100% active is uranium enrichment. And yes, in enrichment, the US government is processing it because it also has weapons applications. Everything else, including mining, there are private companies, and this is the American way. This is how we do business, in which the government provides long-term contracts and floats that industry as they float defense industry. Without government contracts, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon would not exist.
Well, even if we look to the private sector to try and solve this problem, do you think there is something the government could be doing to try and improve the situation?
I think what the government should be doing is mandating non-China procurement, and we're doing it already. You cannot depend on China when you're making your F-35s or you're making your rockets and missiles. In the civilian applications, if you're making solar batteries or magnets for windmills, you can go to the market. But for defense applications, for sure, for nuclear reactors, for components of weapon systems today that are extremely computerized, all this sophisticated electronic production requires rare earths. For military applications, I am adamant that we have to protect our supply chain with contracts, not necessarily with nationalization. And you keep calling it subsidies. I just call it contracts.
In which case, what's stopping the government from just doing that tomorrow?
Like everything else, it's a matter of money and political will. I would put some real heavy hitters because the president can do only so far. There's so many hours in a day, but we need a rare earth czar to build the supply chain. Roosevelt used to do it very effectively in World War II. But of course, we need to put billions of dollars, maybe tens of billions, because all this is very capital intensive. Expenditure is huge. I was looking at the Swedish discovery. They discovered a big deposit, and it will take 15 years and billions of dollars, if they can find it, or euros, to develop it. We need to allocate these resources now